Dear friend, I doubt not, but you will, both from gazettes and letters, hear of the great calamity that hath befallen this island by a terrible earthquake on the 7th instant, which hath thrown down almost all the houses, churches, sugar works, mills, and bridges through the whole country. It tore the rocks and mountains, destroyed some whole plantations, and threw them into the sea. Port Royal had much the greatest share in this terrible judgment of God. I will therefore be more particular in giving you an account of its proceedings in this place, that you may know what my danger, and how unexpected my preservation. When one thinks of a place famous for its vices, perhaps they think to the biblical examples of Sodom and Gomorrah, or perhaps even the crime-riddled streets of a Prohibition-era Chicago. But there is one place which, unlike Sodom and Gomorrah, has not been entirely erased from existence. There is one place where criminal minds like those of the 1920 Chicago mobsters had placed their efforts not on land, but at sea. A place where for 1 in every 4 buildings there was a brothel, tavern, or gambling den. A place where women could be had for the price of a queen's ransom. Where sobriety and temperance went to die. Foreign concepts to those of drunkenness and willful violence. A place where liquor, gold, and silver ran in the streets just as easily and as readily as rain. A place where men lived fast and died hard, making their fortunes off of the ruin that they would wreak upon the high seas. That place was Port Royal, the wickedest city on earth. The westernmost end of the Palisadoes, a thin tombolo of sand that protects the modern-day harbor of Kingston in Jamaica, has a long and checkered history. Its story goes all the way back to the island's earliest inhabitants, the Taínos, who were a group of people indigenous to the Caribbean. To them, the area was called Caguay or Caguea. Evidence suggests that they used it as a fishing port. The arrival of Christopher Columbus's expedition into the region would mark the end of this. Landing in Jamaica in 1494, the Spanish would decimate the local population as they claimed the island as part of Spain's territories in the New World. The Spanish would go on to call the area of the Palisadoes Cayo de Carina, not to be confused with the similarly named Cayo Carinas in Cuba. Here, when it was little better than the westernmost of a number of keys, they careened their ships on the sand in order to effect repairs. At most, they may have erected 1 or 2 small huts to house sailors there as they worked on their vessels. Jamaica would remain firmly under Spanish rule for the next 160 years. However, even this would soon come to an end. In December 1654, Oliver Cromwell, then Lord Protector of the Commonwealth of England, launched the Western Design, an ambitious campaign intended to bring an end to Spanish domination of the Americas. A naval armada was dispatched from Dartmouth comprised of 18 warships and 20 transport vessels that carried a contingent of thousands of soldiers across the waters of the Atlantic. In command of the fleet were Admiral William Penn and General Robert Venables, both men sharing joint command of the expedition. Their objective was to target Spanish interests within the Caribbean, including settlements and ships. Their first objective was the city of Santo Domingo, on the southern coast of the island of Hispaniola, now part of the modern-day Dominican Republic. The resulting siege would witness an embarrassing and one-sided defeat for the English forces involved. Having been repulsed from their main goal, the expedition would seek to avenge its losses by going elsewhere. They would instead sail further west against the much more important, though comparatively less well-defended island of Jamaica. The island's importance stemmed back to its strategic positioning near several of the major trade routes between Spain and her holdings in the Caribbean, as well as the wider Americas. It would also represent a dagger pointed at the heart of Spanish interests and territories in the New World if it were ever taken by Spain's enemies. This was well understood by the English, who would arrive into the waters of modern-day Kingston Harbor, then called Caguea Bay, on May 10, 1655, with a force of 30 ships. Minor opposition from the Spanish settlers there would be quickly swept aside, although a resistance movement by the population of Jamaican Maroons, communities of runaway slaves, would keep them from gaining full control of the island's interior. There would be major attempts by the Spanish to retake the island, commanded namely by Cristobal Arnaldo de Isasi, a Spanish colonist that had lived there prior to the invasion. These attempts would be repeatedly beaten back, in 1657 at the Battle of Ocho Rios, and more decisively in 1658 at the Battle of Rio Nuevo. The invasion of Jamaica would ultimately serve to intensify the Anglo-Spanish War of 1654–1660, which would see a fractured and Protestant England team up with Catholic France to take on their mutual enemy in Spain. The situation on Jamaica would outlast the actual war itself. With the island annexed, the years following the 1655 invasion would see the English naval forces concentrated at Jamaica gradually dissipate over the next few years. The harsh tropical waters of the region would slowly render them unseaworthy and force them to return to England. None were sent to replace them. The result was that after 1660, there were, for the next 8 years at least, no naval vessels in Jamaica able to aid in the island's defense. This would ultimately put a strain on the new colonial population there, and especially on its leadership. Made Commander-in-Chief of all English forces on Jamaica after the death of his predecessor in 1655, Edward d'Oyley was a parliamentarian, or a supporter of Parliament during the English Civil War. He was also a recently appointed colonel by General Venables, which made him perfect for the position that he would soon be given. Much of d'Oyley's time would be spent fighting the Maroons in the island's interior. However, much more of his worries would be directed towards exterior threats, namely to the fact that he was essentially surrounded by strong Spanish positions throughout the Americas. That, as well as the fact that he had no effective naval force with which to counter a full invasion. With both sides being well aware of Jamaica's strategic value, it was a race against time. D'Oyley saw his answer on the northern shore of Hispaniola. There, groups of English and French pirates and buccaneers, known as the Brethren of the Coast, used the area as a staging ground from which to attack and plunder Spanish shipping. Their greatest and most well-fortified presence was on the island of Tortuga, off the northern shores of Hispaniola, modern Haiti. However, it was not able to provide them with the same ability to resupply or to manage their captured earnings in the way the Caguay, Cayo de Carina, or the Point did. With this in mind, d'Oyley sought to develop a mutually beneficial relationship where the fledgling English colony would gain naval defenses, protection, as well as some financial revenue, while the Brethren of the Coast gained an excellent harbor, a good market for their loot, better facilities with which to repair their ships, and the ability to restock their supplies. There is next to no documentation of d'Oyley's earliest dealings and negotiations with the buccaneers. However, by 1659 there is a plethora of information to confirm his interests in their affairs, namely in the ships they had stolen, as well as arbitrating between and supplying them. Many would become privateers, bearing a letter of marque from d'Oyley that would officialize their activities against the Spanish. Some of these included names such as the Frenchman Captain Le Pen and the Englishman Captain Maurice Williams. D'Oyley stretched his discretionary powers as governor, erecting a prizes court, which officially managed the disposal and selling of prizes or possessions captured from the Spanish, something which was not approved by the Admiralty Commissioners in England. D'Oyley would be appointed Jamaica's first royal governor in 1660 by King Charles II, who himself had only just been restored to the English throne after 9 years in exile. The next 2 years of his governorship would be shared between dealing with the persistent Maroons of the interior and the privateers of the coast. In the latter case, privateering was becoming so lucrative and attractive to colonists that merchant ships and plantations began suffering from labor shortages. The governor himself grew worried about the abject lack of a proper English naval presence at Port Royal, and his complete reliance on the fragile loyalties of the privateers. The problem was not only that the privateers might not be willing to defend the island against a full-blown Spanish invasion, but that they also occasionally didn't distinguish between enemy vessels and friendly ones, viewing both as a prize. D'Oyley did his best to curb these behaviors. Nevertheless, the end of his governorship in 1662 would show the fruits of his decision to garner their aid. Though the privateers were never called upon to repulse a major Spanish assault, they would essentially prove the statement true: the best defense is a good offense. Their presence in Port Royal, their constant attacks on Spanish shipping, would make them a strong deterrent against invasion. However, while d'Oyley had received news of his commissioning as royal governor in February of 1661, he also received news of an armistice made between England and Spain. He would go on to release a proclamation calling for the end of attacks against the Spanish. This proclamation would enrage the populace of Port Royal, who would go on to mostly ignore it. D'Oyley would eventually return to England in 1662, possibly concerned for his safety. Jamaica's new governor, Thomas Hickman Windsor, a royalist, would take his place in August of that year. Windsor would arrive with the task of reversing the last 7 years of Tiole's privateering policies and to recommence proper trade and relations with Spain. This effort would be stymied, however, both by the residents of Port Royal and the Spanish governors, whose interests had been repeatedly harmed by the actions of the privateers. Tensions would soon break out once more and culminate in Windsor ordering Sir Christopher Mings, an English naval officer and privateer, to raid the town of Santiago de Cuba. Mings would launch an invasion that would surpass expectations. With an expedition of 11 ships and 1,300 men, he would successfully take the town and blow up its defending fort. The raid would prove so effective that it would fray Anglo-Spanish relations and cause King Charles II to disavow the actions of his governor in approving it. Windsor called in all commissions for privateers to keep them in his employ, allowing them to attack and seize Spaniards and return them to Jamaica. He would leave for England later in October, just 3 months after arriving, presumably because of a decline in health. Even so, the successes at Santiago de Cuba would convince the Council of Jamaica to approve another raid, this one against the port city of Campeche on Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula. Mings would also be appointed to lead this one, which would be amassed from volunteering crews of privateers, amounting to the largest pirate fleet yet seen in the Caribbean, with 14 ships and between 1,400 and 1,600 pirates. Captaining one of the ships of this fleet around this time was a 28-year-old Welshman named Henry Morgan, who would take part in the invasion. The attackers would set out from Port Royal in January and sack the city the following month, a 2-hour-long land battle ending in the privateers taking 14 ships and 150,000 Spanish pieces of eight. The plan had involved landing a large ground-based force to attack a fortified settlement, which otherwise might not have fallen to a seaborne raid. It is possible that this style of attack inspired Morgan's later sack of Panama. The sacking of Campeche would earn heated complaints from the Spanish and would force King Charles to forbid further raids of the same nature. This policy would be taken up by the next royal governor of Jamaica, Thomas Modiford, who, despite his intentions to limit privateering, would go on to become one of its most effective supporters.